January 17, 1945. The winter sun barely pierces the gray horizon, casting a pale light over the frozen mud of the Ardennes. Smoke curls from shattered trees, and the acrid scent of cordite hangs in the air. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of a Panzer rolls across the field, metal tracks crushing debris under its weight. In a shell crater, a lone artillery gunner kneels, frost stiffening his fingers as he checks his cannon. His comrades whisper, skeptical of the idea he has proposed, turning the gun backward, aiming at what everyone believes is an impossible target. Laughter had met his suggestion, brief and bitter, yet he stands resolute, every heartbeat echoing like a drum in the silence between explosions. Around him, the battlefield groans with tension. Jagged wreckage of tanks, scattered helmets, and frozen footprints that tell stories of men who will never return. He breathes, measuring distance, wind, and trajectory in an instant. Behind him, the Panzer advances, confident and blind to the threat that waits. One calculated shot, one moment of courage could change the course of this engagement, and perhaps the fate of those who still fight beside him. By early 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final brutal stages. The Allied forces were pressing from the west, moving relentlessly through France, Belgium, and into Germany, while the Soviets surged from the east, pushing a battered Wehrmacht back across their shrinking territory. The Ardennes, a dense forested region of Belgium and Luxembourg, had become a frozen crucible of conflict, a place where the terrain itself seemed to conspire against those who fought there. Snow and ice coated the ground, concealing hidden dangers, mines, shell craters, and the bodies of men who had fallen in the weeks before. Winter winds cut like blades, carrying the distant echoes of artillery fire and the crackle of gushoes, and fire over jagged hills and tree lines. It was here that both sides tested ingenuity against desperation. German Panzer divisions, though weakened by losses on multiple fronts, still maintained pockets of armored power. These machines, Panthers, Tigers, and the ubiquitous Panzer IV, were formidable, their thick armor and powerful guns a lethal deterrent against infantry and traditional field artillery. They moved with purpose, slow but unstoppable, crushing any obstacle in their path. The Allies, conversely, relied on a combination of combined arms tactics: infantry supported by artillery, engineers clearing obstacles, and air support when the weather allowed. The constant pressure forced soldiers to adapt rapidly, and improvisation was not a choice. It was survival. Artillery units played a central role in this environment. Deployed in concealed positions, often behind ridges or within forest clearings, their presence was critical for slowing panzer advances and protecting infantry positions. Yet even the most well-trained crews were constrained by conventional doctrine. Cannons were designed to fire forward along predictable arcs, aiming at targets within line of sight or guided by forward observers. The standard tactics worked well against infantry or stationary targets, but when a panzer approached from an unexpected angle, especially behind the gun, those tactics became dangerously limited. It was in these extreme conditions that soldiers began to experiment, testing ideas that would have seemed reckless in peacetime. The gunner's unit, part of a small artillery battery attached to an infantry regiment, had seen months of continuous action. Morale was fraying, exhaustion evident in every gesture, every frostbitten face. Supply lines were stretched thin, shells scarce, and every decision carried consequences measured in lives. Despite this, the unit had achieved a reputation for resilience. They were accustomed to facing armored threats and had learned to anticipate the cunning of German tactics. Still, the Panzer was a different challenge entirely. The enemy's armor could shrug off most shells unless hits were precise or unexpected. Standard procedures demanded patience, careful coordination, and most critically, forward-facing firing positions. Amid these constraints, the artillery gunner's idea emerged. It was simple in concept, but radical in practice. Why not reverse the gun, point it at the advancing panzer behind the position, and fire? The suggestion initially met with disbelief. Commanders and fellow soldiers alike laughed, dismissing it as fantasy. Cannons were not meant to swivel backward under live fire, and doing so could risk the gun, the crew, or worse. Yet the physics were sound, the calculations plausible, and in a landscape where survival often required bending the rules of convention, the gunner's idea began to take root. The terrain amplified both the danger and the opportunity. Snowbanks, tree trunks, and shell craters created natural defilades, masking positions from enemy observation. Visibility was limited, and the chaotic arrangement of ice-covered debris could hide threats or conceal advantages. The artillery crews had to make rapid assessments: which angles could be exploited, which shots might surprise the enemy, and how best to maximize the limited ammunition they carried. Each decision carried weight. One miscalculation could result in the loss of a gun, a crew, or a crucial defensive position. In the background, the larger war pressed on relentlessly. Hitler's forces were stretched to the breaking point, forced into desperate counterattacks to delay the inevitable. Allied commanders, aware of the Panzer threat, pushed for innovation and initiative at every level. Officers encouraged junior soldiers to exercise judgment in the field, recognizing that ingenuity could compensate, even briefly, for shortages and manpower or equipment. It was in this crucible of exhaustion, fear, and necessity that the gunner's unconventional solution would be tested, standing at the intersection of human courage, tactical opportunity, and the unforgiving realities of mechanized warfare. The stage was set: a frozen battlefield, a lone artillery gunner, and an approaching panzer that would soon force the theory into practice. What had begun as skepticism, even ridicule, was about to confront the harshest of tests, one that would reveal the extraordinary potential of a single individual in the chaos of war. The artillery unit that would soon face the Panzer threat was a small, tightly knit team. Comprised of men who had fought together through France, the Low Countries, and now Belgium, their cohesion was more than professional, it was almost familial. Each man knew the other's habits, strengths, and weaknesses. Fatigue had carved lines into their faces, yet their eyes remained sharp, scanning horizons for movement, listening for the faintest echo of distant engines. Their cannon, a standard 105mm field gun, was reliable, familiar, and heavy. It had delivered countless rounds against infantry and lightly armored targets, but it had never been designed to confront a fully armored panzer at point-blank range from behind. Their positioning was precarious. Hidden behind a ridge and flanked by shattered trees, the battery occupied a defensive spot intended to cover an open field where enemy armor might advance. Ordinarily, the cannon would face forward, projecting shells into the path of incoming threats. The gunner's suggestion to reverse the gun drew laughter and incredulity. Commanders initially shook their heads, concerned about structural damage, recoil, and the risk to the crew. Yet under the circumstances, hesitation was a luxury. They were low on shells, outnumbered in firepower, and faced the harsh truth that waiting for the enemy to follow textbook maneuvers might be fatal. The reverse firing concept was simple in its audacity. Use the cannon's power in a non-traditional orientation, targeting the rear of any panzer that bypassed the front lines. While physics allowed it, execution demanded precision. The gun had to be secured, its angle calculated to account for elevation, recoil, and the unpredictable frozen terrain. The crew needed to anticipate the panzer's speed, armor thickness, and turret orientation, all while under enemy observation. Any miscalculation could result in catastrophe, but if successful, it could destroy the enemy's most formidable advantage, a tank thought nearly invincible in such conditions. Historical precedent for unconventional artillery tactics existed, though it was rare. Soldiers in previous campaigns had experimented with high-angle fire, indirect targeting, and field improvisations. In each case, success relied on a combination of ingenuity, courage, and sheer luck. The Ardennes, in its harsh winter, demanded the same. Snow-concealed paths, ice transformed shallow craters into death traps, and every gun emplacement required constant vigilance. Every sound, engine rumble, frozen branch snapping, or distant artillery blast could be a clue to enemy movement or an omen of disaster. The unit's morale was a fragile balance between fatigue, fear, and determination. Many had already witnessed the destruction wrought by German tanks on Allied positions, men torn from foxholes, weapons shattered, and entire squads forced into retreat. The fear of encountering a panzer head-on was not theoretical. It was ingrained, a memory of colleagues lost to armor and firepower. Against this backdrop, the gunner's confidence in the reverse-firing maneuver appeared reckless, yet there was a spark of hope. Now, the idea worked. It could turn the tide of a small skirmish, protect the infantry, and perhaps even delay the enemy advance long enough to save lives. The artillery crews prepared meticulously. Tools, shells, and calculations were checked and rechecked. Frost-covered hands adjusted sighting mechanisms, measured distances, and ensured the gun was capable of functioning in its unusual orientation. Each man understood the stakes. They had been trained to fire forward, to rely on orders and doctrine, but now their survival, and the survival of those around them, demanded adaptation. Rules that applied in manuals had to be reinterpreted. In war, ingenuity often mattered as much as firepower, and in this moment, it could make the difference between life and death. Above all, the scene illustrated the delicate balance between human ingenuity and mechanical precision. The Panzer, with its heavy armor and deadly cannon, represented the apex of German engineering, confident and imposing. The artillery gunner, armed only with calculations, courage, and an unorthodox idea, embodied the unpredictability of war. Both forces were about to collide in a moment that would test every assumption about tactics, technology, and individual initiative. As the morning light shifted and the cold deepened, the artillery crew braced for the approach of the Panzer. Every detail mattered: the angle of the gun, the timing of the shot, the awareness of the men around it. The battlefield, frozen and silent except for distant echoes, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for an outcome dictated not by doctrine but by daring. What followed would not only test a single idea, but also reveal how far human courage and innovation could reach in the face of overwhelming force. The human element of this engagement cannot be overstated. Fear was a constant companion, creeping into every decision and every movement on the battlefield. The artillery gunner, young but experienced, carried the weight of both responsibility and skepticism. His comrades had laughed at the notion of firing a cannon backward, but he had no time for doubt. Every frostbitten finger, every muscle aching from days of continuous vigilance, was poised for action. The fear was not abstract, it was tangible, a cold pressure in the chest as he measured angles, calculated distances, and imagined the Panzer looming over the ridge. Courage in this moment was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it. The gunner's mind raced through possibilities, balancing hope against risk, knowing that any miscalculation could result in the destruction of the gun, his crew, or worse, himself. Around him, the other men watched silently, a mixture of apprehension and trust marking their faces. They had followed him through impossible odds before, and now their faith would be tested against one of the most dangerous machines of the war. Tactically, the scenario presented an unusual challenge. Standard artillery doctrine assumed the enemy would approach predictably, allowing shells to land with devastating effect along pre-calculated lines. The Panzer, however, moved with deadly purpose and near immunity to conventional shots. Its armor was designed to deflect or absorb impacts, and its mobility allowed it to exploit gaps in defensive positions. The gunner's unit could not rely solely on doctrine. They had to think in three dimensions: anticipating the Panzer's path, accounting for obstacles, and integrating terrain into their strategy. The reverse-firing maneuver was unconventional but potentially decisive. By aiming at the rear, the gunner sought to exploit a vulnerability that would otherwise remain untapped, turning a defensive posture into an offensive opportunity. Precision, timing, and coordination were critical, and any deviation could render the effort futile. Technological considerations were equally pressing. The artillery piece itself, while reliable, was not designed for reverse deployment. Recoil could destabilize the carriage, frost could impede moving parts, and sighting mechanisms required careful recalibration. Ammunition was limited, each shell precious. The gunner had to consider projectile velocity, angle of descent, and armor thickness. Even a slight miscalculation could result in a glancing hit, wasting a critical resource and exposing the crew to counterattack. In addition, environmental factors, snow, ice, wind, introduced variables that could alter the trajectory of shells. Technology in this case was both a tool and a challenge, demanding skill, experience, and courage to manipulate effectively. The Panzer represented the pinnacle of mechanized engineering, and the gunner's cannon had to match it with ingenuity rather than brute force. Morale intertwined with every decision on the battlefield. Soldiers' confidence was fragile after weeks of relentless combat, yet moments of innovation, however risky, offered a psychological edge. The crew's willingness to entertain the reverse-firing idea reflected a shared understanding. Survival sometimes demanded breaking the rules. This mental flexibility contrasted sharply with the rigid predictability of the enemy, whose own tactics relied heavily on established protocols. The gunner's initiative, therefore, was not merely a technical maneuver, it was a statement of human agency against mechanical dominance. Fear and hope coexisted, shaping not only the physical outcome but the emotional landscape of those involved. Finally, the leadership angle influenced the entire engagement. Commanders were aware of the artillery unit's precarious situation. Their instructions had always emphasized caution, adherence to doctrine, and minimizing unnecessary risks. Yet, on the frozen battlefield of the Ardennes, command had to accommodate improvisation. The gunner, though a junior officer or enlisted man, was empowered by circumstance to take initiative. This moment exemplified how effective leadership sometimes depended on trusting individuals' judgment. especially when standard tactics failed. The success or failure of this maneuver would reflect not only on the gunner but also on the culture of decision-making within the unit. The interplay of human courage, tactical acumen, technological mastery, and leadership created a perfect storm of conditions that made the reverse firing idea possible. Each element reinforced the others, demonstrating that innovation in warfare is rarely the product of a single factor. Rather, it emerges from the convergence of necessity, ingenuity, and the relentless pressures of survival. On that frozen morning, the artillery crew and their gunners stood at the intersection of these forces, aware that history often turns on the smallest, most unexpected acts. The tension between man, machine, and environment had reached a breaking point. The Panzer advanced steadily, its presence a looming reminder of the stakes. Every calculation, every motion of the gun, every held breath contributed to a delicate balance that could tip toward disaster or triumph. This convergence of angles, human, tactical, technological, and leadership, set the stage for a decisive moment that would soon unfold, one that could redefine the expectations of what a single artillery gunner might achieve in the midst of overwhelming enemy power. From the enemy's perspective, the Panzer crew approached with confidence. These men had been trained to expect artillery fire to come from conventional positions, to anticipate calculations and angles derived from standard doctrine. They were experienced, having faced numerous field guns in prior engagements, and their instincts were honed to exploit any predictable weakness. The thought of an artillery piece turned backward, aimed at them from behind, would have seemed preposterous. Yet, in war, unpredictability is often the most potent weapon. The Panzer crew relied on their armor, their mobility, and their discipline, unaware that a single act of ingenuity could exploit a vulnerability that no manual or training exercise had ever considered. Their focus remained on advancing along the prescribed path, confident that no threat could emerge from behind, blind to the danger they were hurtling toward. The moral angle of the engagement adds a layer of complexity to the story. War, by its nature, demands decisions with profound consequences. The artillery gunner knew that attempting reverse fire carried immense risk, not only to himself but also to his crew and the surrounding infantry. Each choice required weighing potential benefit against possible catastrophe. Yet, moral courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to act when the stakes are highest. The gunner's resolve demonstrated the ethical dimension of improvisation in combat, the responsibility to protect comrades and to seize opportunities to neutralize threats, even when conventional methods fail. The laughter of peers at his suggestion was a natural human reaction, a mixture of disbelief and the instinct to cling to routine in the midst of chaos. Overcoming that doubt, embracing risk, and committing to action was, in itself, a moral triumph. Tactically, the enemy's blind spot revealed the potency of non-traditional thinking. Artillery was typically seen as a defensive or preparatory measure designed to soften the enemy before infantry engagement. The Panzer's rear, heavily armored in some models but often less protected than the front or sides, represented an exploitable weakness if approached creatively. The gunner's decision to target it inverted the expected dynamic, turning defense into offense. It demonstrated a principle often overlooked in military history. Innovation frequently emerges when necessity meets imagination. In the frozen Ardennes, where every second and every shell mattered, this tactical flexibility could redefine the boundaries of possibility. Technologically, the artillery and Panzer represented contrasting philosophies. The Panzer embodied concentrated power, uniformity, and reliability under standardized conditions. Its thick armor, cannon, and coordinated crews had dominated battlefields for years. The field gun, comparatively humble, relied on precision, adaptability, and human calculation. The reverse firing maneuver highlighted how technology, when combined with creativity and audacity, could overcome limitations imposed by both physics and doctrine. In essence, the gunner's cannon became more than a weapon. It became an instrument of adaptive warfare, demonstrating that even simple technology could challenge the most advanced machinery under the right conditions. Human perception, both enemy and allied, also played a crucial role. The initial disbelief from comrades reflected an understandable adherence to established norms. The enemy's confidence was equally rooted in expectation and habit. The confrontation illustrated that war is as much psychological as physical. Beliefs, assumptions, and morale shape behavior as powerfully as steel and explosives, a single act that defies ease. Expectation can induce fear, hesitation, or even panic, shifting the battlefield's momentum without a single additional round fired. The The gunner's initiative demonstrated that understanding human perception is as vital as mastering tactics or technology. Leadership considerations threaded through the encounter. Junior soldiers are often constrained by orders and hierarchy, but effective command requires the recognition that flexibility and initiative can be decisive. In this case, the leadership environment allowed the gunner to act, balancing authority with the necessity of immediate decision-making. The alignment of command tolerance, unit cohesion, and individual courage created the conditions in which unconventional tactics could succeed. Such alignment is rare in warfare but can prove pivotal when it occurs, shaping outcomes that appear improbable in hindsight. As the Panzer drew closer, these angles, enemy assumptions, moral responsibility, tactical ingenuity, technological contrast, human perception, and leadership intertwined to create a perfect storm. Each perspective emphasized a different aspect of the engagement, yet together they formed a comprehensive picture of what made the reverse firing maneuver both possible and consequential. The stage was set, the actors in place, and the forces of chance, courage, and calculation converged. What followed would test the limits of human creativity under extreme conditions, setting up a moment of decisive action that could alter the trajectory of this small but critical battle. The morning air was brittle and still, carrying the faint hiss of frost against metal. The Panzer had emerged over the ridge, its dark silhouette cutting through the winter light. The artillery gunner tightened his grip on the cold steel of the 105mm cannon, checking the sight one last time. Around him, the men of his unit moved with silent precision, each aware that the success of this maneuver depended on coordination and timing. The laughter of doubt had long since faded. In its place was a tense concentration, a shared understanding that every second counted. As the Panzer advanced, the gunner calculated distance, elevation, and velocity in a fraction of a heartbeat. The machine's tracks churned frozen earth, scattering debris in its wake. Its turret swung with mechanical certainty, scanning the forward battlefield, oblivious to the threat growing behind it. The artillery crew, having reversed the gun, worked quickly to stabilize the carriage, adjusting supports and braces to manage recoil that would now push in an unconventional direction. Frost made every movement awkward, but discipline and training carried the crew through. Each man knew the importance of precision. Even a slight misalignment could waste a precious shell, or worse, trigger catastrophic damage to the gun and personnel. The first shell was loaded. Its weight seemed heavier than normal in the gunner's gloved hands. He aimed at the approaching Panzer, focusing not on fear but on calculation. Wind, slope, and distance were accounted for. Every variable mattered. Around him, the artillerymen watched in silence, hearts beating in unison. The Panzer's engine growled steadily, a mechanical predator unaware that its assumed invulnerability had just been challenged. The gunner exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The cannon recoiled sharply, the force pushing back against supports, yet the gun held. The shell leapt from the barrel, arcing over frozen terrain, striking the Panzer's rear armor with a metallic shriek that echoed through the quiet battlefield. Sparks flew, metal crumpled, the machine staggered. Haggard, tracks catching on debris, its turret jerking violently. The Panzer crew, trained to expect forward artillery fire, had not anticipated a projectile from behind. Confusion rippled through their ranks as alarms blared and hatches rattled open. A second shell followed almost immediately, loaded and aimed with mechanical efficiency. Each man moved with the rhythm of countless rehearsals, yet tempered by the adrenaline of imminent danger. The gunner's calculations held true. Distance, armor thickness, and angle combined to produce devastating effect. The Panzer shuddered under the impact, the rear armor punctured, and the engine began to smoke. The crew inside fought to regain control, but the damage was critical. Its advance faltered. Where once it had seemed unstoppable, the Panzer now hesitated, a moment of vulnerability that the artillery unit had exploited. Around the field, the atmosphere shifted. Allied infantry, previously entrenched and tense, glimpsed the unfolding miracle. Confidence flickered in their eyes as the Panzer's momentum faltered. The artillery crew, silent yet resolute, recognized the significance of what they had achieved. This was more than a technical success. It was a psychological victory. Fear of the Panzer's invincibility had been replaced by the realization that ingenuity and precision could turn the tide, even in the face of overwhelming mechanized force. The Panzer, still smoking, attempted to reposition, but the artillery crew anticipated its movements. Each shot now required split-second timing, adjustments for recoil, terrain, and the unpredictable responses of the enemy machine. The gunner remained calm, his mind calculating, heart steady despite the roar of machinery and the knowledge that each round expended was irreplaceable. Ammunition was finite, mistakes were unforgiving, yet with every impact, the Panzer's dominance waned, its aura of invulnerability cracking under the audacity of human ingenuity. This moment highlighted the convergence of preparation, courage, and improvisation. The artillery unit had turned doctrine on its head, redefining what was possible for field guns and small crews. It also underscored the importance of individual initiative in warfare. While armies rely on structure, hierarchy, and established procedures, it is often the decisions of a single person, acting decisively in a critical moment, that shape outcomes in ways that doctrine alone cannot predict. The Panzer's stalled advance created a ripple effect. Enemy infantry accompanying the armored vehicle hesitated, unsure of the threat emanating from behind what they assumed was friendly territory. The artillery crew's unconventional tactic had not only neutralized the immediate danger but had also introduced chaos into the enemy's operational rhythm. In war, hesitation is fatal, and the gunner had manufactured it with precision and courage. The cold morning seemed to hold its breath as the Panzer, crippled and smoking, lay momentarily paralyzed in the frozen field. The artillery crew, exhausted but unwavering, prepared for the next critical moment, knowing that survival depended on continued vigilance, coordination, and the audacity that had just delivered such extraordinary results. This was not the end. It was the turning point, the moment when courage, skill, and unconventional thinking collided to reshape the battlefield in ways no one could have predicted. The Panzer's tracks ground against frozen earth, its engine coughing thick smoke that drifted over the battlefield. Inside, the crew scrambled, alarms ringing, hatches rattling, and instruments damaged from the repeated impacts. They had never anticipated an artillery gun firing from behind, and the disorientation as immediate. Mechanical precision alone could not compensate for a vulnerability exploited in an unexpected way. The artillery crew had seized that moment, transforming surprise into decisive action. Outside the Panzer, the battlefield became a tableau of chaos and opportunity. Infantry units accompanying the tank hesitated, unsure of where the next round might come from. Soldiers froze in trenches and shell craters, calculating the risk of exposure. The gunner, aware of the enemy's hesitation, continued to feed shells into the cannon with deliberate speed. Each round struck the Panzer in rapid succession, targeting structural weaknesses that were rarely addressed in standard training. Sparks flew, metal twisted, and smoke billowed as the machine's mobility faltered. Every hit was precise, every calculation validated by the gunner's knowledge of trajectory and armor thickness. Around the gun, the artillery crew moved like a single organism. Frostbitten fingers loaded shells, adjusted braces, and recalibrated sights with synchronized efficiency. There was no panic, only measured action under pressure. Each man understood that failure could result in destruction, yet the training, trust, and leadership cultivated over months of relentless combat allowed them to function flawlessly. The Panzer's dominance, once assumed absolute, was now in question, its aura of invincibility shattered in the cold morning light. The psychological impact on the enemy extended beyond the mechanical damage. German soldiers nearby paused, staring at the smoking vehicle, their confidence shaken. An armored machine meant to instill fear now lay crippled and vulnerable. Hesitation spread, a ripple of uncertainty that affected not only the immediate Panzer crew, but also the broader tactical formation. The artillery crew had done more than disable a tank. They had altered the rhythm of the battlefield, creating a space where initiative, speed, and ingenuity dictated the flow of events. Commanders on both sides recognized the significance of the encounter. Allied officers observing the engagement noted the gunners' improvisation with admiration. It was a clear demonstration that unconventional thinking could overcome mechanical superiority, and that courage in the moment often had disproportionate effects. Reports later described the maneuver as audacious, highlighting the skill and decisiveness of the artillery crew. For the German command, the event underscored the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated equipment when faced with unexpected tactics. As the Panzer staggered, the gunner assessed the situation with meticulous attention. Further shots were calculated to exploit critical weaknesses without wasting ammunition. Smoke and steam obscured vision, yet his calculations remained precise. With each round, the machine became less of a threat and more of a target to dismantle systematically. The artillery crew, synchronized in their efforts, embodied the principle that cohesion under pressure multiplies effectiveness. The battlefield shifted in tone, Allied infantry, previously cautious, gained renewed confidence, taking advantage of the Panzer's immobilization. Their movements became deliberate, coordinated, and effective, supported by artillery fire that now included unconventional angles. The enemy, demoralized and confused, struggled to respond. The gunners' single initiative had created a cascade effect, demonstrating that small actions, when executed decisively, could produce outcomes that influence the wider engagement. Amid the tension, the human aspect remained central. The artillery crew felt the weight of every decision, aware that they were living on the edge of chance. Exhaustion pressed upon them, frost numbing fingers and toes, yet focus remained unwavering. Adrenaline sharpened senses, but it was discipline and training that ensured accuracy. The gunner's leadership, quiet but firm, had instilled trust in his comrades, allowing them to function effectively under extreme pressure. Courage, knowledge, and unity had converged in a moment that balanced on the knife's edge between disaster and triumph. In the final moments of the engagement, the Panzer ceased all forward motion. Its tracks were damaged, its engine compromised, and its crew incapacitated by confusion and smoke. What had once appeared as an unstoppable threat was neutralized not by overwhelming force, but by precise calculation, rapid adaptation, and unorthodox thinking. The artillery crew stood over their gun, exhausted, yet aware of the extraordinary outcome they had achieved. Victory had been carved from ingenuity, courage, and disciplined action. The frozen morning seemed to exhale as the immediate danger passed. Yet the broader significance of the event was already clear. A single act of calculated improvisation had shifted the balance of a small engagement, altering both the physical and psychological landscape of the battlefield. It was a turning point, not in the war itself, but in the understanding of how initiative, innovation, and courage could redefine the limits of possibility under fire. From fear and skepticism had emerged a decisive moment, a lesson in how human creativity can meet and overcome mechanical power. The battlefield settled into an uneasy quiet after the Panzer's destruction. Smoke drifted over churned mud and broken trees, leaving a landscape scarred by both fire and ice. For the artillery crew, there was little time to celebrate. The engagement had taken every ounce of their concentration, and exhaustion pressed on them like the weight of the frozen sky. Yet even in this fatigue, there was a palpable sense of achievement. The immediate threat had been neutralized, and the unit had proven the effectiveness of unconventional tactics under extreme conditions. Reports circulated quickly through the command chain. Officers recorded the gunner's maneuver with detailed notes on timing, angles, and outcomes. They highlighted the psychological effect on enemy forces as much as the physical damage. The Panzer, once a symbol of mechanical dominance, had been disabled through ingenuity rather than brute force, and this fact resonated through the ranks. Fellow soldiers began to see the potential in creative, adaptive thinking, understanding that survival on the battlefield often required bending or reinterpreting standard doctrine. The German side also reacted. The Panzer crew had been stunned, scrambling to report the engagement to higher command. Their accounts emphasized both surprise and disbelief, noting that a conventional artillery gun had managed to exploit a rear vulnerability with devastating precision. Intelligence reports later compiled by German officers described the encounter as an unusual, almost inexplicable event, acknowledging the rare effectiveness of adaptive enemy tactics. This recognition, though tinged with frustration, reinforced the idea that unpredictability could level the playing field, even when confronting seemingly invincible machinery. Allied infantry units in proximity to the engagement observed the effects with renewed confidence. The immobilization of the Panzer allowed them to reposition, advance, and secure key terrain that had previously been threatened. The ripple effect of the gunner's action extended beyond the immediate destruction of the tank. It disrupted enemy formations, slowed momentum, and created an opportunity for tactical consolidation. Casualties were minimized, positions stabilized, and morale improved. Soldiers who had faced relentless armored assaults gained a renewed belief that human ingenuity could alter outcomes even against mechanized superiority. The artillery crew themselves became symbols of initiative and resilience. Their precise coordination, calm under pressure, and willingness to embrace risk were noted in official reports. Leadership praised their ability to adapt doctrine to the circumstances, reinforcing a culture that valued creative problem-solving alongside discipline. In war, where standard procedures often dominate, these instances of deviation can be both risky and transformative. The crew's success demonstrated that even under the harshest conditions, human skill and calculated daring could produce results that exceeded expectations. Field assessments recorded tangible consequences. The Panzer was rendered immobile and was eventually abandoned by German forces. Critical components, including the engine and rear armor, were irreparably damaged. Shell fragments, scorched metal, and twisted tracks marked the exact location of the engagement, offering clear evidence of the effectiveness of reverse fire. Nearby artillery positions took note, updating firing procedures and considering unconventional approaches in future operations. The encounter served as a practical case study in adaptive tactics, merging human courage, technological understanding, and rapid decision-making into a decisive outcome. This aftermath extended beyond physical destruction. Confidence among Allied forces increased, while the enemy's perception of armored invulnerability was shaken. The engagement underscored the importance of initiative, demonstrating that even a single soldier, acting decisively and creatively, could have a disproportionate effect on battlefield dynamics. In a frozen field scarred by smoke and steel, the lessons of that morning would echo far beyond the immediate skirmish, influencing both morale and tactical thinking as the Ardennes campaign pressed onward. In the weeks that followed, the story of the gunners' reverse firing spread across multiple units with quiet reverence. It was retold not as an act of luck but as a study in adaptability, the kind of battlefield innovation that only emerged under extreme pressure. Field reports, unit briefings, and debrief sessions all cited the event, emphasizing its value in countering superior armor through unconventional methods. For the artillery divisions operating in Europe during the final months of the war, this story became a teaching example, a demonstration that survival and success often depended not solely on firepower, but on thought and initiative. Senior officers reviewing the Ardennes operations noted that small unit decisions had frequently determined broader outcomes. The gunners' calculated improvisation illustrated a principle increasingly recognized as vital, that the ability to think independently within a structured command system could create tactical flexibility when plans failed. The frozen fields of Belgium had witnessed not just a clash of armies but an evolution in battlefield mentality. Doctrine began to shift subtly, not officially rewritten but quietly adapted. Officers encouraged more discretion in the field, trusting trained soldiers to act decisively when communication lines broke or when unexpected opportunities emerged. The psychological ripple of the event was also profound. Among the men of the artillery battery, the laughter that had once greeted the gunner's idea was replaced by enduring respect. What had seemed impossible was now a symbol of creative defiance under fire. These soldiers carried that lesson forward into future engagements, their confidence tempered by the understanding that war rewarded both discipline and imagination. The incident reinforced an unspoken truth shared by countless soldiers, that courage was not merely the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender the mind to it. German records recovered after the war confirmed the demoralizing effect of the encounter. Commanders noted a temporary breakdown in communication and morale within the affected units. The loss of the Panzer, though minor in strategic scale, undermined the psychological advantage that armored forces typically enjoyed. Infantry units that once advanced confidently behind tanks began to hesitate, their trust in machinery shaken. For the first time, some acknowledged that human unpredictability could turn precision engineering into liability. The perception of absolute superiority, the essence of blitzkrieg philosophy, was quietly eroded by moments like these. In post-war analyses, military historians found the engagement noteworthy for its blend of simplicity and innovation. There was no advanced technology involved, no elaborate planning or superior equipment. It was an ordinary artillery crew operating under pressure, applying their knowledge of physics and combat experience in an unconventional way. That contrast between simplicity and impact gave the story enduring relevance. Training manuals and after-action reviews occasionally cited it as an example of situational adaptation, a technical phrase for what soldiers simply called thinking under fire. For the gunner himself, recognition came modestly. His name was recorded in battalion reports, mentioned in commendations, and shared among peers as an example of steady nerve and sharp mind. But like so many who served, he carried the memory quietly, preferring the anonymity of those who simply did their duty. His innovation had not been born of ambition or pride. It had emerged from necessity, sharpened by survival and shaped by the brutal logic of war. As spring approached and the snow began to melt across the Ardennes, the field where the Panzer fell remained scarred. Rusted metal, shattered glass, and twisted shell fragments marked the spot where ingenuity had triumphed over fear. Passing soldiers would sometimes pause there, not for glory, but as a reminder of what human resolve could accomplish against impossible odds. The war would soon shift eastward, and the world would move toward its violent conclusion. Yet within that vast conflict, this small engagement endured as a symbol of tactical evolution, proof that the balance between machine and man could still be tipped by intellect, courage, and the unyielding instinct to adapt. War has always been a contest of adaptation. Machines evolve, weapons advance, and strategies grow more complex, yet the essence remains the same. It is still fought by human beings, fragile yet capable of extraordinary ingenuity. The story of the gunner who fired in reverse is not just about one man's quick thinking under pressure. It is about the timeless truth that courage and intellect can coexist even in chaos. His act, born in the frozen stillness of a desperate moment, symbolized the unbreakable link between reason and survival. In the shadow of industrial warfare, when tanks, aircraft, and artillery seemed to dominate every battlefield, his decision was a quiet reminder that technology alone does not define victory. The human mind, alert, flexible, and determined, remains the deciding factor. On that bitter winter day, the gunner refused to surrender to routine. He defied the narrow margins of conventional doctrine, trusting instinct over fear, precision over panic. In doing so, he reshaped the meaning of what one soldier could achieve. History tends to remember the grand offensives, the famous generals, and the sweeping victories. But behind every campaign lie smaller stories like this. Moments of choice, seconds of clarity amid chaos, when ordinary men changed outcomes through determination and ingenuity. These are the fragments that reveal the deeper character of war, not only its destruction, but its relentless demand for adaptation. As the guns of Europe eventually fell silent, the lesson of that winter encounter endured. It whispered across generations of soldiers and engineers, a lesson that progress is not only mechanical but human. In every era, the future of warfare and perhaps of civilization itself depends on the capacity to think differently when the world demands conformity. And so the laughter that once met one man's idea became an echo of history's irony, a sound replaced in time by respect. For in the end, the greatest victories are often born not from strength alone, but from the courage to see what others overlook, and the will to act when logic and survival become one.